Okay, we ready?
Yep.
Episode 1. All right. Oh shit, the fire. All right. Hey everybody, welcome to the first episode of the SaaS Report. My name's Matt Aird. I'm the founder at Sales Science. And today we're going to be looking at ZoomInfo's Q2 results. So what went wrong and what they might be able to do to turn it around. We're also going to be looking at the Q2 letter to shareholders from Palantir's CEO, Alex Karp. So he came out and took a big swing at the B2B SaaS industry. We're going to take a look at that and some of the lessons that SaaS founders might be able to take from that letter. And we're also going to be reviewing our Q2 SaaS metrics report, which, if I get my shit together, is going to be finished in the next 2 weeks. So we'll do a bit of a preview on that. But first, let's get to the news from this week. Okay, so for the last couple of weeks, we've had Q2 results from a bunch of different companies, right? We're right in the middle of Q2 earnings season. A few of the companies that have announced recently, Palantir, Box, Workday, and Procore. So let's take a closer look at their numbers. So first of all, let's take a look at Workday. So Workday is one of the OG SaaS companies, right? They were founded in 2005. In Q2, they added $352 million in ARR, right? $352 million in 90 days is insane. To put that in perspective, that's $4 million a day, almost, right? If you include Saturdays and Sundays. So just like an insane performance by Workday in Q2. They've grown ARR to $7.6 billion now. They had 17% ARR growth year over year, a magic number of 0.66, CAC payback of 24 months, which is kind of right in the middle range of the companies that we track, and a rule of 40 of 41. Interestingly for Workday, they're one of the few companies that actually report on this metric called gross revenue retention. So gross revenue retention, or GRR, is similar to one of the other metrics that we track, which is net revenue retention, or NRR. The difference here is that GRR doesn't take into account any of the upsells or expansions that you get from existing customers. So the way that it's calculated is if your customer base paid you $100 million in Q2 of last year, you take that same customer cohort and then you see, how much of that existing 100 million did you retain this year? So all it's factoring in there is downsells and churn, basically, right? So we don't get any uptick from expansion revenue, right? We're only counting how much of the revenue that we generated from the same customers last year do we retain this year. So it's a much better sign of, how sticky is the actual customer base. Because when we look at net revenue retention, what can often happen is you can churn out a certain cohort of your customers, but as long as another cohort of your customers is expanding or is upselling, that can kind of be hidden in the metric. You don't get that with gross revenue retention, right? It really is a more straightforward way of understanding, are we holding on to the revenue that we had last year, this year? So 95% is a really great benchmark for that metric, right? Really good job by Workday there. All in all, really good quarter. They're trading at 9 times ARR, which at a $7 billion run rate is pretty healthy for them. Right, moving on to Box. So Box is the enterprise grade kind of storage solution, right? Think like Dropbox, but for large companies. They've had a bit of struggle recently in growing ARR. So they've had low to mid-digit ARR growth over the last 6 quarters. And we saw that again this quarter, right? So in Q2 of 25, which is the last period for Box, they spent $92.6 million on sales and marketing to generate just $22 million in net new ARR. So that gives them a CAC payback of 63 months. So pretty far outside the range of most of the other companies that we're tracking, right? The top performers there are companies like Atlassian are around 12 months. They're a bit of an outlier. Companies like Monday and HubSpot are closer to kind of the low 22 months. So 60 odd months for Box is not a great sign there, right? What we're seeing is pretty poor go-to-market efficiency. And the reason for that is they're just really struggling to grow top-line revenue and therefore, recurring revenue in the business. Despite that, the share price did jump almost 9% after the earnings call. And the reason for that is that they beat top-line revenue estimates. So the forecast was for just over 269 million in Q2 revenue. Revenue came in at over 270 million. And a positive sign of life for them is that they actually had 10% growth in billings. So billings is different from revenue. The way that billings is calculated is basically billings is the total of all of the invoices that you sent out to customers in that period, right? So the way to think about that is that you could send an invoice out to a customer that is going to prepay you for the next 12 months, right? And so that revenue isn't recognized in this quarter, but right, you generate the invoice, or in other words, the billings in that quarter. And so they saw 10% growth in billings year over year in Q2, which is a good sign. So we should see some of that start to flow through into ARR growth over the next couple of quarters. Some other headline stats for Box. So they grew ARR 3.3%. They had net revenue retention of 102%, up from 101% in the prior year. A magic number of only 0.26, so that's down from 0.45 a year ago. Operating income of $20 million for the quarter. So whilst they're not growing at a really fast rate, they are still pretty efficient, right? Being able to generate $20 million in operating income. And I think that flowed through to about $20 million in net income for the quarter as well, which is decent. But that slow growth is really hampering their valuation, right? Box is only valued at about 4.2 times ARR at the moment, which is really at the lower end of the companies that we track. Also reported this week was Palantir. So Palantir is the intelligence software company, so to speak, right? Their customers are mostly government organizations, intelligence services, and then also some large enterprise customers as well. We'll talk about them a little bit later on in the show because their CEO, Alex Karp, came out swinging on B2B SaaS companies this week, so we'll dive into his Q2 letter to shareholders. But yeah, really good performance by Palantir in Q2. Their share price is up almost 90% year to date. In Q2, they grew ARR 27%, so they're now at a $2.7 billion run rate. They increased operating income, get this, 945% year over year. So that grew from about $10 million to $100 million. Had a magic number of 0.91, so really efficient. Basically what that means is that for every dollar that they're spending on sales and marketing, they're adding about 90 cents in net new ARR. Had CAC payback of just 16 months for the quarter, which is again, gold standard. Now, obviously, as the world becomes more unstable geopolitically, as there's more conflict or more crisis, that benefits Palantir, right? People are purchasing Palantir to get insights into, geopolitical events. Intelligence agencies use them, right? So the more scary or dangerous the world is, right, the better Palantir is going to do. And we certainly have no shortage of that at the moment. And that's kind of reflected in their valuation. So they're trading at, the upper end of the companies that we track. So they're valued at 26 times ARR right now. And the final company for this week is a company called Procore. So Procore sells a software solution to construction companies, helping them to manage their jobs, to manage large construction projects. Interestingly, it took Procore 16 years to go from 0 to 200 million in ARR. And they've just added $200 million in ARR in the last 12 months. That's the power of SaaS, right? That's the power of compounding. If you can generate new customers and you can get them to continue spending money with you year over year, the business is going to scale, and Procore is a great testament to that. They added more than 1,000 net new customers in the last 12 months, and those customers just continue to spend more and more with Procore every year, so net revenue retention is 110% for Q2. Some other interesting stats from the Q2 numbers. So average contract value was up 17%. So an average customer now pays them just under $68,000 per year, which is really healthy ACV. They cut their operating loss by 75%. So making a concerted effort to make the business a lot more efficient. So magic number and CAC payback were flat. Magic number was 0.5, same as last year. CAC payback at just under 30 months. And Procore is just another really good example of a company that has transitioned from kind of this grow at all costs mentality to much more sustainable growth at in a fiscally responsible way. So how do we grow while trimming operating loss, improving margins, improving free cash flow? So another really solid quarter there by Procore. All right, that's it for the news this week. Let's have a look at ZoomInfo's Q2 results. Right, so what went wrong and what they can do moving forward to potentially improve that. Right, so ZoomInfo is in the situation that you don't want to be in as a SaaS company. They've got declining annual recurring revenue. So over the past 2 quarters, ARR has been going down and not up. Obviously, that's a position you don't want to be in. So how did they get here? So the main issue for ZoomInfo is net revenue retention rates. So they're not able to hold on to the revenue that they've generated previously. For the last 3 quarters, net revenue retention is 87%, 85%, and then again in Q2 of this year was at 85%. Basically what that means is they're losing 15% of their recurring revenue basis every quarter, which means that in order to grow, right, they have to add at least 16% in revenue from net new customers, right? And that's going to be a struggle for any SaaS company in this operating environment. So what's been going wrong? Why are ZoomInfo churning customers at such a high rate? Well, I think there are three core problems that ZoomInfo is running into at the moment. Number one is that the space they operate in is just much more competitive now than it was 3 or 4 years ago. Number two, there is obviously challenges in the macro environment. We've had layoffs at SaaS companies, which has resulted in kind of lower seat growth, right, or lower expansion from existing customer accounts. And less salespeople being hired means kind of less demand for seats at ZoomInfo. And then number three, I think, is that they have an image problem. So let's have a look at each of those issues in a little bit more detail. So when we think about ZoomInfo's competitive environment, the first thing that most people think about today is Apollo, right? So Apollo is this private SaaS, competitor. They've been growing pretty aggressively over the past few years, and they've driven that mainly through a kind of PLG social media marketing lens, right? They've been trying to go, how can we get the same quality of data in people's hands without the purchasing friction and without the exorbitant price tag, right? So what ZoomInfo used to charge 20 or 30 grand a year for, Apollo has been offering customers for $5,000 or $6,000. Now, it's debatable whether or not the quality of the data is on par. There is an argument that, ZoomInfo's data quality is slightly better than Apollo's, but when you're talking about a, 75 to 80% discount on the price tag, that's just going to get a lot of SMBs to move from ZoomInfo to Apollo, right? Or to not even consider ZoomInfo in the first place because they can get what they feel is the similar product for 75 or 80% off, right? And so that competitive environment from that kind of primary competitor in Apollo has created some issues for them. But Apollo isn't the only one, right? You've got other companies like Cognizant, you've got Lucia, you've got Seamless, and then you've got kind of the mid-tier or lower tier data providers that you might use in a waterfall model through a solution like Clay, right? There are so many tools out there now that you can use to find email addresses and mobile phone numbers. ZoomInfo just really doesn't have a stranglehold on that, contact data information anymore. And that's new for them, right? And they haven't adjusted to that as well as they perhaps could have just yet. Right, the second thing is that companies are just much more cost conscious right now, right? So you've got a macroeconomic environment, especially in probably one of their core customer segments, which is other SaaS and technology companies, where efficiencies and cost cutting has become much more important than it was 3 or 4 years ago. Right, you've got a drive from the market to see these companies return, positive operating margins, and so that means everyone's looking at their cost base. And so what that means is there's been more scrutiny on purchases, there's been less headcount growth. That naturally flows through to the number of seats or licenses that ZoomInfo can sell. So the third issue that they're facing is they've got a bit of an image problem in the market. So they've run a fairly aggressive kind of like sales-led culture at ZoomInfo for a number of years now. And if that's not executed well, it can rub people the wrong way, right? On the Q2 earnings post that I put up on LinkedIn, Frank Devine commented, "It's going to get worse before it gets better," basically. I think words to the effect of, in all of the RevOps communities that I'm a part of, ZoomInfo is the favorite punching bag. So they've got a bit of an issue here, right, where the core users of their product don't respect the brand, and they're going to need to make some shifts in order to correct that if they want to get control of this image problem and position themselves again as kind of the clear market leader. All right, so if those are the problems, right, what can ZoomInfo do to course correct and get back on track? Had an interesting comment from Colin Cadmus on a ZoomInfo related post I put up on LinkedIn. So Colin suggested that ZoomInfo flip their spend on sales and marketing and R&D. Right, so take the 30-odd% of revenue that they're spending on sales and marketing and spend that on R&D, and take the 15% that they're spending on R&D and spend that on sales and marketing, right? So the idea here is to invest more in the product to create more differentiation. So I think that's actually an interesting idea, right? ZoomInfo is in a position where they have more resources than their competitors, And so if they invested that into product development, they're probably able to create some distance between them and the rest of the market. We can see that they're starting to take steps in that direction. If we look at their Copilot solution that they launched 3 or 4 months ago, that's an interesting innovation. I think actually that this is one of the best use cases for AI in sales right now. And that is the idea that the AI helps to surface the accounts that you should be working now based on key information that's relevant to your sales process, right? So is there news or events? Is there a champion that's moved from an organization that you sold to previously to a new organization? Is there headcount growth that's material to you? Did the company mention something in their earnings call that relates to a problem that you can solve, right? Using AI to help to sift and sort through all of this data to surface the accounts that salespeople should be working on now, I think is a great idea. Now, ZoomInfo have a version of that in their Copilot offering. If you combine that with the account and contact intelligence that ZoomInfo have, you have something interesting, right? Because the AI not only surfaces, hey, here's the account that you should be reaching out to, but can also pair that with, and by the way, here's the key contact's mobile number and email address, right? Get hold of them now. So this seems to be generating some traction in the market. So they've got $18 million in annual recurring revenue to subscriptions for their Copilot product. Over 1,000 users of that product at this point. So that means that we're getting an ACV of somewhere around $18,000 for a Copilot subscription, right? This is differentiated, right? This creates some distance between them and Apollo. This creates some distance between them and Cognizant, between them and Lucia, between them and Seamless, right? It helps to separate them from the rest of the pack, which is the position that they need to move towards at the moment. So step number 1, potentially invest more in R&D to create distance between them as the market leader and the rest of the field. Idea number 2 is to continue to move up market, right? So move away from the SMB customers who you've had trouble getting to pay you in the past and continue to move more towards the enterprise. So we saw bad debt write-offs of about 30 odd million cause a big jump in G&A expenses in Q2. So G&A expenses in Q2 jumped from 49 million in 2023 to 75 million in Q2 of 2024, right? And most of that can be reflected by the increase in bad debts that they suffered from that SMB cohort not paying them, right? So if they move away from that customer segment and move more towards the enterprise, what would that look like? So ZoomInfo has announced more of a focus on what they're calling data as a service, right? So this is a product that's targeted to larger customers and is supposedly central in these customers' AI strategy, right? So when you're implementing an AI strategy, the data that you have access to is key. ZoomInfo has a lot of data on businesses and on people in terms of where they're based, the size of them, what industry they're in, how many employees they have, the names of those people, right? And so they can provide a bunch of intelligence to these customers to help them create lookalikes or training data, right, for the AI engines or models that these companies are trying to build or train. That business grew 23% year over year, right? So if we think core business shrunk, this business increased 23%, that's a positive sign. Now, admittedly, that's probably coming off a pretty small base. This is a new product line for them, but there are some signs of life there. That product line also had 117% net revenue retention, right? So when we compare that to the 85% net revenue retention across the business entirely, again, we're seeing some positive signs here. Now, I think the interesting thing to look at here is another company that plays in a similar space, which is Dun & Bradstreet, right? So Dun & Bradstreet, or D&B, is another data company. They operate in a similar space, and they have 2 product lines. One is kind of a product for finance, which helps finance companies to kind of assess the credit risk or credit worthiness of a customer. And the other product line helps sales and marketing teams in very much the same way that ZoomInfo does. Looking at D&B's Q2 report, what we can see is that there's an interesting chunk of market share here that ZoomInfo should own, right? So if we break out the North American customer segmentation for Dun & Bradstreet, what we can see is 45% of their revenue is attributed to data that they provide to sales and marketing teams. That's $760 million a year. 550 million of that is provided to large and enterprise level customers. Now, the product here is basically you can connect APIs or feeders from your systems into either Dun & Bradstreet or ZoomInfo, right? And you're able to pull data from their system to enrich company information or contact information as you need it, right? That's the data as a service model. Now, there must be a way that ZoomInfo can position themselves as the superior product in this field, right? With the amount of innovation that they have, with the scale that they have in terms of revenue, there has to be a way that they can start to chip away at market share here from D&B back into ZoomInfo from this data as a service product. I think that's a real opportunity for them to look to try and exploit. Right, so in summary, I think ZoomInfo it's a good product, right? We use it. I think their data quality is probably leading in the market, but they've got a couple of issues, right? They need to figure out how to innovate. They haven't done that for a while, and they need to figure out how to potentially move more up market. Because what that does is it removes the price sensitivity from the equation, and you're going to be dealing with customers that are going to pay. I also think we're possibly in a situation where you see a lot of the customers that have churned away to lower cost options actually start to come back over the next few quarters as they realize that the data quality isn't quite the same, right? So yes, I'm able to pay, 60 or 70% less, but is that trade-off worth it? If I'm talking, a few $1,000s a year, is it worth a 5 or 10% degradation in terms of like data accuracy, right? For a company like us, we just buy all of the data solutions, right? So we have 6 or 7 subscriptions because to us, data completeness and data accuracy is just more important than whatever the incremental cost is of acquiring or purchasing another solution, right? So we get access to all of them so that we can ensure that we have the data coverage that we require in order to execute the campaigns properly. So yeah, my plan of attack for ZoomInfo, a couple of things, right? Number one is a focus on R&D, right? How can we create actual differentiation in our offering so that we can create distance between us and the rest of the field? And then number two is figure out the plan of attack to just continue moving up market, right? Figure out how to take share off D&B, figure out how to get more enterprise customers because they're stickier, they pay you more, and they're less price sensitive. All right, for the second segment today, let's have a look at the letter to shareholders from Palantir CEO Alex Karp. So if you don't know who this guy is, after you've finished watching this, go to YouTube and look at any Alex Karp interview. This guy just does not miss, right? In this Q2 letter to shareholders, he comes out swinging in a big way to the rest of the B2B SaaS community. This guy is not cut from your typical kind of like CEO cloth, right? He isn't giving canned responses. He isn't showing up in a suit and tie. He isn't politically correct. He basically says what he thinks, and it's super refreshing. What also adds to that is that like this guy sells to governments and large corporations only, right? So he's selling into a space where you'd think that like image and being like prim and proper and being politically correct would be a requirement for the job. He just like throws all of that out the window and is just like, no, this is who I am, this is what I think, this is what I believe. If you don't like me, no problem, right? So he's a breath of fresh air in like the corporate world at the moment. So if you haven't seen any Alex Karp stuff, go and check it out. All right, so I want to read an excerpt from this Q2 letter because I think it is just absolutely brilliant. So in the Q2 letter to shareholders, Alex Karp writes, "The playbooks of the past are no longer working, and even the people who had believed in them now know this. The enterprise software business had for years been crowded with companies whose principal innovation was selling a product that was capable of little more than reincorporating and shuffling data around in what amounted to yet another storage system. A premium was placed on developing software products whose principal purpose was to sell themselves, and a perception of value became more important than value itself. The rise and increasing sophistication of artificial intelligence capabilities have exposed the extent of dysfunction within enterprise software deployments. This was the era of thin technology and an abandonment of any real interest in results. Those companies, however, are now being swept to the side. They attempted to seize the cultural and moral high ground at the expense of anything resembling a commitment to outcomes. And society, not to mention customers, have grown disinterested in their theater." So that's how he opens up his Q2 letter to shareholders. You need to go and check out and read the rest of the letter. It is equally impactful. But this made me think about something else that I read recently, which is a quote from Naval. So I'm sure all of you know Naval. Naval has this quote where he says that you're doing marketing because you failed at product, and you're doing sales because you failed at marketing. And the idea here is that The truly great companies create products that are differentiated enough and that generate enough value that they sell themselves, right? They don't need marketing and they don't need sales in order to generate customers, because the value that they create on their own is transformational. And that's the same premise here that Alex Karp is talking about, right? He's like, the B2B SaaS industry has gotten away from creating products that are actually valuable into focusing on like hacks, right? Or kind of like growth tactics that allow us to increase our revenue, right? That's where Alex talks about, right, the primary objective of the software was to continue to sell itself, right? Rather than actually creating like transformative value for customers so that, right, they just buy your stuff, they continue to buy more of it, and they tell their friends about it. So I think this is like a lesson here for anyone that's starting a company, regardless of whether it's in SaaS or as anything else, is how can you make the product so good that it just sells itself, right? How can you deliver outcomes that are so good that the people who experience it just want to tell everyone else that's like them about it, right? When you create something like that, you're creating something that's truly transformational. Business is easy then, right? Because you don't have to figure out marketing, you don't have to figure out sales. The product does all of the work for you. So concentrate on that as much as you can, rather than all of the kind of hacks and and tactics that are going to kind of drive incremental improvement. All right, so I just want to highlight something from our Q1 report that we'll compare and contrast next week, right? And that is the composition of the rule of 40 for SaaS companies in Q1 of 2024 versus SaaS companies in Q1 of 2022. So for those of you that don't remember, rule of 40 basically is a combination of the free cash flow that you generate and the ARR growth rate that you generate, right? So the idea of the rule of 40 is to create some kind of balance between companies that are growing quickly and companies that are efficient from a cash flow perspective, right? So the way that you calculate the rule of 40 is you take the growth rate and then you add the free cash flow rate to that. So let's say a company is growing at 60% but has a negative 20% free cash flow margin, right? You take 60 plus negative 20, it would give you a rule of 40 of 40. And the idea here is that, good is 40 basically. So you want to sum those two numbers together and it ends up somewhere around 40. So in Q1 of 2022, the median rule of 40 for the SaaS companies that we track was 55. Now that was made up of, if you think about the two numbers that we summed together, that was made up of a median of 49 points of growth and 6 points of free cash flow margin. In Q1 of 2024, that had completely changed, right? So we went from 49% growth to 23% growth, and we went from 6% free cash flow margin to 22% free cash flow margin, right? So yes, rule of 40 decreased from 55 to 45, but the bigger change, in my opinion, was that we were seeing the shift that companies were making from growth to efficiency, right? And so what we want to have a look at next week is, has this trend continued or has it stabilized at those rates, right? So we'll do a deep dive on that next week and look at how Q2 numbers in 2024 are stacking up versus what we saw in the previous quarter. And we'll also look at other companies that have reported. So Salesforce, on the day of recording this, Salesforce just released Q2 numbers, and CrowdStrike just released Q2 numbers as well. So that'll be super interesting to look at. Obviously, you remember the CrowdStrike outage that happened in Q2. So it'll be interesting to see if that had any impact yet, or if we're still to see the flow-on effects from that into Q3. So we'll break down those two earnings reports in more detail. And we'll also look at a bit of a preview on our Q2 SaaS metrics report. Thanks for watching episode 1. If you like it, please like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Tell us what we did well, tell us what we did wrong. Let me know what you want to see in the next few episodes. And thank you for joining us. Goodbye.